start showing you particle illusion here. All right, it's going to move quick, but there's going to be lots of great examples and time for some questions. So particle illusion, I've just got a quick little burst of particles that comes out here. And if you've used particle illusion before, you know that the way to affect particles after they're created is to use a force object. And so I've got a force object set up here. Right now it's just kind of a normal straight force object blowing particles to the right. But we're going to go ahead and change it into a fluids object. Yes, we now have fluid simulation inside particle illusion. And inside the force object, you'll see a new Enable Fluid Dynamics checkbox. If I just check that, instantly we see that we have a fluid simulation happening inside that force area. Again, I'm going to move really quickly. A lot of what you are probably wondering about is going to be shown in some examples, and I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty. We will cover that in future videos. But what's great about this, I guess the main thing that you should take away from this, two things. Number one, we made it as easy as possible to use fluids in particle illusion. Not a lot of stuff to set up. Like you saw, I just click one checkbox and it starts doing something automatically. The second thing I want to point out, and it's a kind of important thing, is that the particles themselves provide the fluid motion. So if you don't have particles moving around into that force object or into the fluids, nothing's going to be happening. So the particles kind of control everything. That makes it, one, super easy to set up, and also really easy to add fluids to existing emitters. You know, if you have a smoke emitter or fire of some sort, you can drop it into a fluids force and immediately get fluid dynamics without having to twiddle with a lot of settings. And so let's take a look at that real quick. The settings that you do have inside the fluids, we've really got just 3 parameters inside the force object itself. It's the viscosity, the swirling, and the simulation detail. Simulation detail is the main one. Lower settings are faster to calculate, but they give less detail. So that if you want big sweeping motion and you don't care about a lot of little details, go to the lowest setting. The middle setting, 32, is pretty much the one I use most of the time, just because it's a good compromise between a lot of little details and speed. And then if you need a lot of detail, go up to 64. It's not ideal for every situation, and I think this emitter might be set up not quite perfectly to get the most out of a 64 resolution simulation, but that's essentially the high detailed one. It's a little bit slower to calculate, and so you probably don't want to use it all the time, but those are your options. The second, I think, most important parameter here is swirling. And swirling, with a single emitter, it's really important. So if I set swirling to 0, I've just got a stream of particles and not too much is going on because there's nothing sort of interfering with that flow. It's just straight through. You get a little bit of a sort of bow wave at the beginning of that, but nothing else happening. If I had more emitters or other forces or something, then those particles would start swirling a little bit more. But usually just turn up swirling and that adds some in there for you. Real easy. And viscosity is the one that I don't use too much, but it's there. You can crank that up, and that controls the sort of the thickness of the fluid. So rather, like when it's 0, think of it as maybe water, and then as you crank that up, maybe it turns more toward oil, and so things move a little more slowly, less sort of turbulence happens in it. And that's all the controls you need, really. The rest of the control just comes from the emitters themselves, really. So if I go ahead and, let's say, rotate this emitter a little bit and then increase the velocity, you'll start seeing the fluids behaving in a little bit different way. Also, the type of force object is really important to what the final look is. And right now I have this set to a box force, and there's 3 types. There's a box where the strength or the force strength is all in one direction, and right now, like I said, it's set to going to the right. We've got a box grid, which breaks that up into a bunch of different smaller forces that can be randomized. And so that gives you can see right away that gave me sort of a different look going on here, because those particles are now making those fluids swirl all different directions. And then there's the sphere. And if I change it to a sphere, this to me is kind of the most useful one for general sort of fluids play, let's call it. So, if you just want to experiment with making things swirl in cool ways, I recommend this changing that force into a sphere. It's really the best way to do it. I also want to point out something that's inherent to force objects that you might not have thought of, and that's any particles that don't go into that force area are not affected by the fluid simulation. So anything outside of that area is just straight normal particles. Then it starts the simulation, and if I can go ahead and crank up that velocity a little bit more, we'll see some of those particles maybe coming out of the other side, and then they no longer are affected by that fluid simulation. So I think that shows pretty briefly how particles work. I'm going to go ahead now and add my second emitter in here, because I think for me fluids really kind of come into their own when there's multiple emitters going on here. So I added my second emitter, and I didn't have to set anything up for fluids, again, because the fluids simulation is inside the force object. So I can add as many emitters as I want, and they will start combining their motion into the fluid sim. And then what's really interesting is we have this affect fluids parameter inside the emitters. Now this is what you use to influence the fluids. So if I wanted to, and I wanted, let's say, these green particles to provide a lot more, let's say, of the motion to those fluids, I can crank that up a little bit, the effect fluids, or I can crank down the effect fluids on the other emitter. And now you'll start seeing that the green particles are really taking over. I should probably turn this strength of this emitter down as well, so the particles are not getting all sucked into the center. But it's really a flexible way to go ahead and interact particles and just get some really neat results. And this is all working in 3D, of course. So if we switch to the world, these emitters are kind of set up a little bit narrow, so the things are happening in a more of a planar way. But if I add some depth to this, or if I offset things, we'll start getting a lot more 3D action going on, and you'll see that in some of my other examples too. All right, so you can see, like, I started adding some more emitters, and I've got some sort of a complex thing going on here, and you might be able to envision that you can do some really complex projects with this sort of thing. But the good news is you don't need to do a lot of work, because we have done a lot of the work for you. And I'm kind of going to segue into another feature here of 2022, and that is library scenes. So you may already be familiar with the fact that we've got a huge collection of emitter libraries, and you get a live preview over here to click and drag around and see what those emitters can do before you add them to your project. Well, in 2022, we've added what we're calling library scenes. And library scenes are a couple key things about them. You'll notice that they have a little plus sign in front of their name. That's so you can tell which ones are scenes. And secondly, they don't have a live preview. So they are just a static image, a thumbnail of what's going on. And that's because essentially the scenes are like a whole project inside a preset. So I'm just going to start and just apply one of these that I know is a nice simple fluids example, and double click that, adds it into my project, and you can see what happened. It added an emitter, it added the fluids force, it actually added another force that is disabled that I could enable to get something else to happen here. But you can see that with very little work, I've just added a cool fluids example here. And at this point in my presentation, I have to switch back and forth between renders and sort of screen sharing. So I have pre-rendered a lot of that out, and Brian is going to go ahead and start showing you what's going on here. Yeah, so here's that same burst example in the rendered form, and then I took that, and now I'm just adding multiple copies of it at different times. So it's just this easy to build up something that's a pretty complex look. So in here is the rendered version where I've just got 3 of the bursts in a row. I have added glow to this as well, but you can see how quickly I built something that was really complex. And then I took that a different way, and I just duplicated that emitter, and then I just made some multiple, a few little changes to it. And that's because the fluids are influenced by the velocity of the particles, the number of particles, all those things. So I added 3 copies of that in, and now you can see that there's just so much going on with like really little effort. And here's another example. I've got 3 emitters that are mixing together in the same fluid object, of course. And now let's say I wanted to add that same burst that I just used, and I wanted to sort of blow those particles apart. So I just added that in time. And I did a draft render here just to see what it looked like at full speed. And it's not really having the impact that I wanted. So I went ahead back to that triple sort of starburst where I had 3 copies in. And that now you can see is blowing those particles away just how I wanted it to do. It's just so much fun to play around with the fluids. It's just a really fun, creative tool. And so now we'll look at some examples of some things that you can do. Here's like a really strong force and some tendrils that are in fluids, just beautiful stuff. Here's a great example of some more multiple emitters all moving together. I'm not going to describe every single one of these. It does repeat a few times. So if you saw something you really liked, it's going to come back around, and I'll make some comments about it. But these were all really pretty easy to set up. And the great thing is every one of these examples is saved in the emitter library, 2022 emitter library as scenes. So you will have these available to just apply as soon as you download and install it. This one's pretty interesting, and it's probably going to end before I can describe it, but it has a force that just moves around and animates negative to positive in the strength and does some really cool things. I'm just so excited about fluids. Really easy to use with, lots of fun. And I think I'm going to open it up to questions now, as these will play a little bit more. And let's see if we have any questions coming in from anybody.